So I want to take the time to try to make sure we understand. How many of you all have heard the phrase, thou shalt not covet? What's the rest of the verse? Thy neighbor's what? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. That's only part of it. It's a common paraphrase. But the actual, where is it from?
10 Commandments.
All right, 10 Commandments. The actual commandment reads, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, nor shalt, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, King James Version, nor his donkey, we got kids here, so, nor his donkey, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. In the New Living Translation, you must not covet your neighbor's house, you must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servants, oxen, donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. In the 10 Commandments, the Hebrew word for covet is shamad, meaning delight in, find beautiful, greatly beloved. Covet, desire, lust after, precious thing. Modern Christianity, when paraphrases this verse, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and in doing so, believe this commandment is a prohibition against adultery. Now, some of that comes from misunderstanding Jesus' teaching on adultery, where he says that to covet your neighbor's wife is adultery. So you got two different commandments. You got the 7th commandment says don't commit adultery. I think it's the 7th. I forgot to double check that number. But thou shalt not commit adultery, one commandment. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's stuff is another commandment, 10th commandment. Jesus comes along and says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I'll tell you, if you even look at another man's wife and lust after her, same word, covet, then it's the same thing as adultery. So we got two different teachings here. You got one teaching about morality within a marriage. You got another teaching about desiring people's stuff. So the 10th commandment is not a regulation upon sexual desire. Instead, it's a prohibition upon desiring the property or status of somebody else. Yet Jesus' teaching does present a link between the sin of adultery and the sin of covetousness. So there's a unique nature to the offense of infidelity to one spouse. Okay, that's something in and of itself. But if Jesus is linking these two, there's something to be learned here, something to be considered. Like, we don't talk about covetousness. When was the last time you heard "Thou shalt not covet" brought up in the church?
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been quite a while.
It's been quite okay. If desiring a woman is the equivalent of committing the act of adultery, you have to take the time to consider what can be said of desiring what lay within the boundaries of somebody else. How serious of an issue is this? Even though we don't talk about it, if Jesus is saying desiring a wife is the same thing as committing adultery, and he's referencing the concept of covetousness, as you may as well have did it, where does the general issue of covetousness and envy and desiring somebody else's stuff fall? Adultery is a violation of a boundary that exists between a man, his wife, and God. Right? Adultery violates a boundary that exists between a married couple and God, who has solemnized the marriage. If envy of another man's wife is the same thing as violating that boundary, then we got to really take a look as believers about how serious it is when we start to violate people's boundaries by envying or allowing ourselves to envy what we see out of others.
All right.
Whether it's recognition, status, talent, position. I can sing better than they can. I can preach better than they can. How come they don't call on me? How come I don't get picked to do stuff?